Howdy once again, this is Tubalcain, your YouTube shop teacher, and this is part 2 of my build on the STUART Progress steam engine. Now in the first part I just did a little introductory, but in this part I'll actually be starting to cut a little bit iron. So the first part that I'm going to work on is the box bed, and boy, these are just beautiful castings. It's of course nice gray cast iron. There's not a whole lot to do on this, just some holes to drill. And I'm going to clean up the bottom and then just take a little bit off of these two bosses. A little bit of filing, but not too much necessary. I'll probably take this off on the belt sander. The pattern draft is 5 degrees, which means that the pattern is tapered 5 degrees as checked with my little protractor here. So I'll just set the sander for 5 degrees and clean up this side. That'll take those gates off. Those are the gates. There's really very little to do here, and in fact I really don't need to do anything. However, I'm going to sand it just a little bit, but there's really no need to machine it, to mill it off, because the surface is pretty level, and this bottom surface is just going to set either on the table or on a wooden base, depending on what the builder decides to do. So file it or do whatever you want, but I'm just going to use this disc sander. And that's actually good enough right there, but I'll spend a little more time off camera because it didn't clean up here yet. Now I'm at the Delta Rockwell sander, and it's set at 5 degrees. I've already cleaned this up a little bit, and there's no need to do very much to it, as I just said. You can use a file, or you can do nothing, because that's part of the charm of a casting, is to see some of the sand marks and minor irregularities. But I think I'll hit this with a file right here. But let me take the gates off now. Getting a little warm, I have to cool it off. You out here that have never worked with cast iron, I just have to warn you that cast iron is a very brittle metal, so you have to hold it with care in a vise, because this thin-walled casting could easily be crushed or cracked, and then it is not repairable. So I'm using soft jaws, and it's just gently clamped, and then I'm going to use a file. There's a few irregularities right here that I will knock off with a file, and I probably need a coarser file than this. Now when you first start filing or machining, there is what I call, it may be an incorrect term, a fire scale on here, so you could tell by the sound how hard that is. And when you go to mill this or some other operation, you're better off taking a cut that is deep enough to go all the way through the fire scale and into the softer material, because taking a real light cleanup cut may dull your cutter. So I'll clean that up with a file offhand. You can do as much or little filing as you desire. As I said just moments ago, the castings are tapered. So to expect to hold them in a vise which has square jaws is unrealistic. At least so if you're going to take heavy cuts. Now you might be able to clamp it and mill these two bosses, but you better pray while you're doing it. So I'm going to take the vise off and clamp this directly onto the table. Also, if you squeeze it too hard in a vise like this, you can crack the casting. There's a lot of mechanical advantage to a vise like this. You know what, there's probably 100 different ways to clamp something like this, and I'm just using these right height clamps on these little bosses right here, but then again I'm over a slot, which isn't the best thing, but I'm not taking much off. It doesn't have to be held very securely, and so these are going to do just fine. It also could be clamped up higher here if the clamps didn't interfere with the part that I'm going to mill. Now if you clamp right in the very center here, there is the possibility of tightening it too much again and cracking that. I know I'm overemphasizing that, but then again maybe I'm not, because we do have some newbies that are doing this that maybe just don't understand the strength of metals yet. So anyway, that's the way I'm going to clamp it. When you look at the drawings for a project like this, you're probably going to find a lot of dimensions missing, simply because they are not dimensioned or do not matter. For instance, how much should I remove from these two bosses? Well, it doesn't matter as long as they are cleaned up. There is no dimension for that. So what I'm going to do is bring the cutter down until it touches, back off just a little bit, and then raise the knee, well, let's say 10 thousandths to start with, and see how that looks. Okay, I'll make it 15. And that was a pretty good guess, because it looks like it's going to clean up. And the same thing down at the other end. Now, cast iron is more or less self-lubricating because there's a lot of graphite and carbon in it. So I'm doing it dry. And that's all there is to it. It took more time for the setup and the clamping than it did for the milling. The drawing makes absolutely no mention to this location or the size of the mounting hole here, so I'm just eyeballing it. So it's about in the center. It looks good. And I'm going to drill it 1/8 inch. If that's not big enough, I'll open it up later on. Well, that's all there is to this piece. Got the 2 holes drilled. Now there'll be 2 other holes drilled here later on to mount this, but I have no way of locating those yet. They'll be located off of this. So I'll set that aside and start this. Now try to organize your parts. So for instance, I keep this, all of the other little parts in my apple crate, and then the little steel screws are in a magnetic holder here, so hopefully I don't lose any of those, because there aren't any extras. Over at the milling machine, the first thing I want to do to this main frame piece is to mill this off flat and take the pattern draft off. You can see this was a split pattern, so it's tapering off in both directions. But here's a piece that rather defies being held. It's just so irregular. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I hope that you do too before you commit yourself to chips. But using this surface here as a reference, I filed it ever so lightly just to get a little bit of the scale off of there. And I'm going to grip it by that, but notice on the other side it's very irregular. So really I'm going to be gripping in the vise between this piece and the flat surfaces like this. And I'm going to let the longer pieces here hang out, because I still feel I have enough there to firmly hold it, and I'll take light cuts. Now I also want to raise this up just a little bit and be assured that this is parallel with the vise jaws. So using a 3/16 inch square tool bit or anything else about a key stock or something like that, that will set up against there. So Setting it in the vise like that. Now I'm just going to grip it gently, lightly, I should say, and take some readings on it. Now using my STUART surface gauge with the little pointed edge, and I've already preset that. I'm going to come over here and take a reading right there. Now if you're old like me, put your magnifiers on and use a flashlight. Get down on your knees or whatever you have to do. You might as well say a little prayer while you're on your knees too, so you don't ruin the casting. And then come down here and take a reading and see if it's the same. Run it clear across and perhaps check it in several different places. Possibly a few little adjustments need to be made. Now if you don't have a surface gauge, you can also just put your cutter in the collet and come over here and bring it till it about touches and crank it down here and see if you have the same reading more or less on both ends. And then you're ready to cut. I'm ready to start milling. I took a real light trial cut from one end to the other, and it looks like that I'm going to be just fine. But the whole idea here is you don't want to taper this off so it's real thin on one end and thicker on the other, and that's why I'm taking such precautions. Wear your safety glasses. That should do it. The bottom is nice and flat. Now I need to mill this surface here. But before I do that, I'm going to take just a little bit off of the top here, and you'll see why in a second. But the casting is a little bit rough, and then I got some filing to do here. So this isn't quite as nice of a casting as the base. And I'm going to clean that up, but I want to clean this up because it serves a purpose. Now since this is flat, it's going to set on these two parallels like that. And then normally a surface like that doesn't really need to be very flat. It could just be filed, but you'll see why I'm doing this in a minute. I'm sorry, but I lost the footage where I milled this off, but there wasn't much to see. Next, I'm going to mill these two surfaces here, and those are the surfaces on which the cylinder oscillates. I want them to be square with the bottom of the base and in line in this direction. So I've filed this surface, and then I just showed you how I cleaned this up a little bit, not all the way across, but that'll be a reference surface also. But I'm going to hold it in the vise like this with this surface on the parallel. Now there's a lot of ways of doing it. This is just the way that I'm doing it. And then I have to use a packing in here so that when I mill this surface I do not touch the hardened vise jaws. So that's going to lay, I know you probably can't see it, but it's going to lay in there. And now after tightening the vise I will be able to mill this surface true. Now again, I'll take off as little as possible here, and I hope you understood my setup. I'm taking off about 10 thousandths. Trying for a pretty decent finish. I probably would have been smarter using a larger diameter end mill so I could do it all in one pass. Now I got to be careful that I do not hit the vice jaws. But I am milling a little bit of that packing off, and I could care less. That's why you see two different colored chips. And that's all there is to that. Again, the setup and the thought of how I'm going to set it up took a lot longer than the cut itself. This really is a small casting, but while I'm here at the belt sander, I'm going to clean that up just a little bit, and this end and right here. Then this will have to be filed. I did a little file work here, nothing fancy. Remember that this is going to be painted. Not that that will cover up any imperfections, but castings are castings. So that's going to fit on there just like that. And the next thing I'm going to do is to lay out the screws and get this fastened on to the base. And looking at the drawing, they call the screws fitting screws. There's no dimensions at all, other than I know that I want them to be on the boss here. So I have already laid them out, center punched them, such that one will end up right about here, and it won't be a blind hole, and the other will be coming out someplace right about here. Now, what size? The screws provided, I believe, were these. Well, they're outrageously small to hold something that big. They're really the head bolts. So I'm going to step it up a notch and use 632, which really is a kind of a small screw, but it looks so large compared to that. And that's what I'm going to use. Remember, they'll be hidden. They're a modern screw, but they'll be hidden underneath. So. And the thread will be in this piece, the clearance holes here. So I will now drill clearance holes for the 632, and then I'm going to transfer them. The two holes are drilled in the base, and I've clamped the frame onto it, centering it on the bosses the way I want it. And I'm going to go ahead and transfer with a transfer punch the front hole. Take it apart, drill it and tap it, put the screw in, then relocate it in order to do this. So I do one at a time rather than being so bold and uncautious, is there such a word, as to do both of them at the same time. But do it either way you want. Starting to shape up. By the way, I did find in the text, rather than the drawing, that it called for an 1/8 inch hole here, and that is what I used to drill mine, 1/8 inch. Anyway, I got one screw in the bottom. Now I will examine it and visually try to get the base here parallel with the frame. Other than that, it doesn't really matter, but it's pretty easy to align the edge of this casting with the two bosses, assuming they have been accurately made. And then I'll simply take the transfer punch and transfer it. Take it apart, drill it and tap it, and reassemble it. I may cut these screws off a little bit later on so they don't stick up. Although it doesn't really bother me, but for the purists in there, they don't like to see that. I'm ready to start drilling some important holes here now, and the drawing calls for the distance between the main crankshaft hole here and the pivot hole to be 2 inches. Now it varies just a little bit because the casting, we had shrinkage and all of that going on, so it's just a little bit different than 2 inches, but it doesn't matter. I will drill on the center of this boss and the center here. Now this is much longer than it needs to be. This is the spigot or stem that I will, I think, hold in a 3-jaw chuck when I check it out here in a minute. And you can see that this is way too long because this is where the flywheel is going to go, and the flywheel hubs need to be faced and brought down to size as well. And then of course the cylinder goes on right here. So now I think you're getting a little visual idea of what this thing should look like when it's finished. Now when they cleaned up this casting, they either tumbled it or shot blasted or something, but they sure didn't do a good job in here as compared to the other side. And I think you can see why. It's just difficult to get in there. I do not have a sandblaster. If I did, I would have cleaned that up. But maybe I can clean that up a little bit with a small wire brush.